Item of business is First Minister's questions. At question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, a low-emission zone came into force in Glasgow. It will prevent many vehicles from entering the city centre, and if a driver breaks the rules, they could face hefty fines into hundreds of pounds. So, can the First Minister tell us how many vehicles applied for an exemption to this scheme but were refused?
First Minister.
First of all, this is of course a scheme run by Glasgow City Council. It's a scheme that I am very supportive of, and of course I think all of the Parliament should be supportive of the low emission zones. Why? Because we know of course that air pollution is a serious problem, particularly in our city conurbations, particularly in Glasgow, and that's why of course the introduction of the LEZ has been welcomed by the likes of Asthma and Lung UK, as well as many other third sector organisations with an interest in public health. I don't have the exact figure to hand that Douglas Ross has asked for, but I do know, of course, that there has been an LEZ exemptions process that has been put in place, and of course a number of time-limited exemptions have been granted. But what I would say to Douglas Ross is I do hope that in his questioning he will be unequivocal in his support for LEZs, because of course every single week, rightly so, members of this Parliament question this government on what more we can do to tackle the climate emergency. In the Conservatives' case, every time we bring forward a measure, or indeed our local authorities bring forward a measure, they seem to oppose it time and time and time again. So it is absolutely critical for all of us that believe in tackling this climate emergency as a priority, that we don't just talk the talk, but we're prepared to walk the walk.
Douglas Ross.
Well, I really hope the First Minister would start answering questions rather than telling opposition leaders what they should be asking, because, as usual with the SNP, the problem with this policy is the delivery. There have been numerous warnings about the implementation from people and organisations across Scotland. SNP members are saying this is an exaggeration. So let's just look at one of the many charities raising concerns. Joe Fitzpatrick, a government minister, wants to shout me down while I am speaking about a charity in Glasgow raising concerns. So maybe Joe Fitzpatrick, the First Minister and the SNP could listen to Homeless Project Scotland. They were refused an exemption and still they heckle. Homeless Project Scotland refused an exemption to use a refrigerated van within the restricted area. Their chairman, Colin McInnes, said it helps to feed 300 people every day. It collects food from 15 to 20 businesses in the city centre, right at the heart of the low-emission zone. His message was simple. Exemptions for exceptional circumstances must be reviewed. Mr McInnes continued, if 300 people queuing for many hours for food on the streets of Glasgow is not exceptional, then they need to publish what is exceptional. Does Humza Yousaf agree this outstanding charity deserves an exemption from this scheme?
First Minister.
I do commend the work that's done by the Homeless Project in Glasgow. We do have to ask ourselves, of course, why are they having to feed so many people in any given week? And that's undoubtedly the case because of over a decade of Tory austerity, because of a cost of living crisis, because of high inflation, because of high energy costs. That is why, of course, they're having to do the work that they're having to do. I would urge Glasgow, as they have already done in my understanding, to engage with the third sector, with charities, including, of course, the Homeless Project. Glasgow have been very transparent. The application process for time-limited exemptions in Glasgow is published on the Glasgow City Council website. There has been, of course, a lead-in time in relation to the LEZ being introduced. So we know, of course, that there is an exemption process, but clearly it is imperative on all of us, whether it's the public who are in Glasgow, whether it's charities, whether it's the third sector, and all of us, to have to make sure we are doing everything possible in our gift to tackle the serious problems around air pollution. I go back to what I said in my first answer, Presiding Officer. Time and time and time again, Douglas Ross will stand up and demand we do more to tackle the climate emergency. But whether it's on DRS, whether it's on the workplace parking levy, whether, of course, it's on LEZ, he will oppose. And why will he oppose? Not because, of course, anything to do with any principled stance in relation to the climate emergency. He opposes it simply because the SNP proposes it, and that is not good enough.
Douglas Ross.
I oppose it when the SNP make a shambolic mess of every one of these schemes that they bring in. And the First Minister wants to commend Homeless Project Scotland, but refuses to stand up and say their one van that helps to feed 300 people every day should get an exemption. That is not commending a charity. That is condemning them and their inability now to do the work they want to do. The delivery of this scheme has been tone deaf to the needs of the city and charities like Homeless Project Scotland. Now, SNP members wanted to heckle me when I spoke about charities. Will they do the same when I now read out quotes from businesses? Because they've also been raising... Now it's Cabinet Secretaries don't want to hear what businesses in Glasgow think. I know Jenny Goruth used to be the Transport Minister, but she should be listening to these points just now.
Mr Ross,
because
please
businesses
continue.
are saying this to politicians across the political spectrum, and SNP members think it's funny. So let's listen. Stephen Grant. It is funny when the Health Secretary is laughing at this. So Stephen Grant of Unite Glasgow Taxi Drivers has said, this is Steve Grant, Unite Glasgow Taxi Drivers said this. This damaging and punitive plan is going to be devastating for our trade, without a shadow of a doubt. Local business owner William Payton, who runs a garage within the restricted zone, says, it just feels like it's been poorly thought out and we've been left in a horrible position because of it. Stuart Patrick, Chief Executive Officer of Glasgow Chambers of Commerce, said, while we are supportive of the aims of the LEZ, the Chamber does not support using it as a political measure to drive all private cars away from the city centre. And this morning, Donald MacLeod of the Nighttime Industries Association said, actually, what we've got here is going to be a low economy zone getting created. He's right, isn't he? And what does Humza Yousaf have to say to all these businesses and all their workers who are concerned that this scheme is going to put jobs at risk?
First Minister.
First and foremost, I go back to the point that there has, of course, been a considerable lead-in time for the Glasgow LEZ coming into place, and there has been extensive engagement. Oh, it's fine for Douglas Ross to dish it out now, but he can't take it when he's standing up with his question. Let me, of course, give Douglas Ross some of the facts around the LEZ in Glasgow. Not only has it had a lengthy and extensive lead-in time, there has, of course, been considerable engagement with businesses, with the community, with the third sector, with charities as well. And in terms of support as well, to support low-income households and small businesses get prepared, the LEZ Support Fund did offer financial support towards the disposal of non-LEZ compliant vehicles. In 2020-2021, the LEZ Support Fund awarded £1.7 million in grants, £3.85 million in 21-22. £5 million was awarded through the LEZ Support Fund in 22-23, and that fund, while it is now closed, of course, however, those eligible were encouraged, of course, to register their interest, and as a result of that fund, the LEZ Support Fund, it resulted in over 2,500 non-LEZ compliant vehicles being disposed or retrofitted with cleaner technology. So there has been funding there, not just for, as I say, low-income households, but in particular for small businesses as well. So when it comes to tackling the climate emergency, something all of us in this chamber claim to have an interest in, claim to say that is a priority, really is easy. The warm words are easy. The rhetoric is easy. Taking action is the hard bit. And this government will never shy away, nor should our local authorities, from taking the tough action that is required in order to tackle the biggest threat our planet faces.
Douglas Ross.
The only thing that answer proved is it took till question 3 for Humza Yousaf to find his pre-prepared script in his folder on this issue. But this LEZ is the latest anti-driver policy from the SNP
Thank you.
that looks like being an absolute shambles in the making. So they've cut investment in roads, they're not tackling Scotland's pothole problems, they're not supporting car drivers, they have proposed a car park tax, and they are increasing the cost of driving across Scotland. Now, approximately 750,000 vehicles in Scotland will be fined if they drive through this zone in Glasgow. The LEZ is hurting charities' ability to function. It's risking jobs, and business leaders think it's going to create a low-economy zone. Wouldn't it have been better, First Minister, to delay this scheme for a year and properly listen to the concerns of businesses, charities, individuals and organisations who have been raising these concerns, have been hoping for a change, but have been left with no answers, no response, and a tone-deaf government who refused to listen to them?
First Minister.
And in the meantime, of course, if we had delayed, more people would have suffered in terms of their asthma, more people would have suffered because of their lung conditions, more people would have suffered because of CPD. More of the citizens of Glasgow would have suffered dire health consequences because we know air pollution in Glasgow is nowhere near the standards that we want it to be, and the LEZ, of course, will help with that. It is an undeniable fact, Presiding Officer, that every time this SNP government brings forward action to tackle the biggest threat our planet faces, that Douglas Ross and the Conservatives oppose time and time and time again. They oppose the workplace parking levy. They oppose, of course, the DRS scheme, even though they had it in their manifesto, that they stood on. Douglas Ross, of course, stood on the manifesto for a deposit return scheme, but now opposes it. And when we look to invest and unleash the potential of the green economy in the North East, what do we get from the UK government, from the Tory UK government? Complete and utter inaction. Not a single penny of funding towards the Scottish cluster or the ACARE or the ACORN project. Not a single penny to support the economy, the green economy.
Members, First Minister, I think we are not going to continue in this vein. We are representatives of the people of Scotland. We are sitting in the National Parliament. I'd be very grateful if all who are tuning in could hear answers and questions. Thank you.
They don't want to hear about the fact that they have been utterly missing from taking any action to tackle the climate emergency here in Scotland. Let me end by saying this to the Conservatives. When it comes to tackling the climate emergency, whether it's LEZs, whether it's DRS, the real potential for Scotland, of course, both from tackling the climate emergency and from an economic point of view, is unleashing the green potential of the North East and of Scotland. For a party that has plundered and taken £300 billion of revenue from the North East, the very least they could do is match our £500 million Just Transition Fund and help us to tackle the climate emergency that is affecting our globe. It's the biggest priority, the biggest threat this country and indeed the world faces.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.